This is basically all you ever wanted to know about the Churchwide Assembly in a nutshell. And I promise in less than 20 minutes, because I've already been warned, the Chiefs play at 12. So hang in there with me. We will address this situation. First of all, as you see by the slide that we have up here, this was the theme of our assembly. We, the church. As Bishop Eaton said, we, the church, we are Lutherans. We are the church together, and what I thought was really powerful was we are church for the sake of the world, meeting human needs. And as I address some of the business that we handled that week, you will see each and every time it had to do with the needs of the people. Injustices were addressed, and it really made me proud to be there. As Pastor said, the assembly took place in Milwaukee, and it was at the Wisconsin Synod, which I have been to a lot of convention centers. I think this was the biggest I've ever been to. This picture here shows 932 voting members. We're not delegates, we're voting members now, that's a new phrase, along with some invited guests and visitors. In the picture, way back in the far left corner is where Central State sat. So we were relatively close to the front, but we were way over to the side. This group represented 66 synods and 9,100 congregations. We gathered the first day on Monday afternoon at 1:30, basically to get knowledge on how to navigate the iPads. This was a paperless convention. Everything was in here, probably saved 500 pages of paper per person because everything was here. So that took a little bit of knowledge and training and how to use those wonderful voting machines. I tell you, if we didn't have voting machines, we'd still probably be there counting those hand ballots, because it was awesome. That evening, we gathered after our meal and after worship, and we met from 6:30 to 9:30. We didn't have short days particularly. And then following that, each morning, we arrived at 8:30. We paused at 10:30 for worship, communion, and then we were back in business after lunch. Worship was awesome. If you can imagine all 932 gathering in this facility, giving God praise and thanks, it was beautiful. The settings that we used for liturgy were varied and different, very inspirational messages. It was a good session. Each day we closed at approximately 5:30. Tuesday evening, however, we gathered for hearings, so we knew what we were voting on as those issues were presented throughout the rest of the week. So I was tired by Friday, let me tell you, but anyway, it was a good time. This is our Central States voting members. There were 13 of us. Bishop Gustafson is in that burgundy shirt onto the far right, and he retired at the end of August. And Bishop-elect Susan Candia is standing there next to me, and she will be installed in October in that position. She was not a voting member. She was simply there as a visitor and to observe. Now, although the theme was we, the church, these two scripture passages were the underlying focus for the entire week. Every speaker I think we had referred to these or the basis of these each and every time they spoke. One, of course, is love your neighbor as yourself. Very evident. The other one was very powerful. We've heard it lots and lots of times, but when you are really dealing with issues of injustice, it makes a whole new meaning. Particularly your last sentence, I tell you the truth, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did it to me. And that really made you stop and think. Pastor asked about my overall perceptions of the week. Well, I tell you, I was proud to be a Lutheran. I was proud to be an ELCA Lutheran after we left there. I was humbled by the number of ministries our church is engaged in. I mean, we only have a smattering knowledge of what the church actually does. So it was very informative for me to see what we do. And finally, I was blessed to see the church in action, particularly addressing those issues of injustices throughout the world. One thing Bishop Eaton said, we are the ELCA. We are willing to take risk for the sake of the gospel, which, as you will see, was very evident throughout the week. The major highlight of the week or the first day, was the re-election of Bishop Eaton as our presiding bishop. She has served a 6-year term, so she was able to run again for another 6-year term, and it was amazing the vote of confidence she received on the very first ballot, which I figured we'd have to go 3 or 4 ballots, but we got it on the first ballot. She had to have 3/4 of the majority. She had 81%. She had 723 votes, first ballot, and that was just tremendous. I just was really pleased with that. I have heard her speak at women's triennial conventions. She was at our Central States Convention 3 years ago, I believe, and she again spoke here several different times. She is not a pretentious, lofty person. Anybody that meets you on an escalator at a convention and high-fives everybody going down the escalator is a good person. And I think she'd come to Cole Camp and we could take her to a beer garden and she would enjoy the crowd immensely. She's just that kind of person. There was one point, and I will tell you this, debates and discussions could get heated at times at convention, and there was one point she just simply lowered her head and shook it and she said, "Oh my gosh, I signed on for 6 more years of this." But that was a tension breaker because we all laughed and applauded, so we all went on. Now, I only am going to discuss about 5 basic pieces of legislation or pieces of business, so I'm watching the time, people, I'm watching the time. I'm going to go to the end of our session where we discuss the budget. I knew you'd love to hear about money, but that's what we're going to talk about for a little bit. The churchwide secretary is a man by the name of Chris Berger. This is a smart man. He knew the Constitution for the ELCA inside out, forwards and backwards. He knew parliamentary procedure. He knew the workings of the church. He and Bishop Eaton referred to things frequently when they were like, "Is this going to work here?" And, you know, that type of thing. And if it got worse, they called in the parliamentarian just to keep us straight. He gave the parochial statistics for the ELCA, which include 3.3 million baptized members, congregational giving, and this is astounding, $1.8 billion in the course of a year. Now, of course, 5.4% of that go to Senate, and I never got a percentage of what went to ELCA, but I'm going to say it was 2 to 3% of that goes to ELCA churchwide. As Chris Berger said, we do not bill our congregations. The ELCA gives from the heart to serve the kingdom of God in a monetary fashion. Then the churchwide treasurer, Lori Feddick, I kind of thought this was a challenge to our congregations. I would take it as such. She noted there are approximately 800,000 ELCA Lutherans that worship weekly. She said, what if everybody would increase their giving by $1 a Sunday, $4 a month? That would generate as much as $45 million in the course of a year, which would leave $42 million for the congregation, $1.5 million for synods, and approximately $1.2 million for churchwide. Just $1 extra. Now, we can take that as a challenge if we want to, but I thought it was very interesting. The budget. Next slide. Oh, excuse me. It was when we got into the budget and you start wading through all those pages of the budget that you realize how many ministries we do have at the ELCA, and these are just a few. World Hunger, we're very familiar with. Malaria campaign, global missions, not just global missions, but domestic missions also. A lot of things for youth and young adult ministries, campus ministry, young adults and global mission, women's leadership initiatives, and congregational vitality. These are just umbrellas. Under that are multiple programs. And the thing is, when you put together a budget, everybody wants a piece of the pie. So this was the budget. So you can see for the next 3 years, we approved a little over $68,000 a year $68 million a year for just basic operations of all these ministries and churchwide office functions. $21.5 million every year goes to World Hunger. That still makes roughly a budget of almost $90 million. In order to make a good budget, though, two items had to take a hit. One was travel expenses for office staff. That was reduced by almost 20%. And the other one that caused a lot of controversy was the reduction of premiums for medical insurance for office staff. They received a higher deductible in order to meet this budget. And this is astounding too. That little measure saved $1.1 million. But it also was a lot of contention at the assembly, so it was decided we'll review this medical expenses and medical insurance over the next year, and hopefully we can take care of our office staff in a much better fashion. Next slide deals with our next issue. Welcoming people is not a political issue for the ELCA. It's a matter of faith. And this comes down to the passage of the Memorial for Sanctuary Church for the ELCA. We are now established as a sanctuary church for migrants and refugees, probably even from time to time the undocumented people also, but we are a sanctuary church. This passed with a vote of 890 yes votes. We've always had a long stand in ELCA about migrants and refugees. For example, the New York Metropolitan Synod has been a sanctuary synod for the last 3 to 5 years. So see, it's nothing new. There's a church in Wichita, Kansas, Christ Lutheran Church. They took in a migrant family from Burma as early as 2012. They brought them into their community. They provided them with an apartment. They took them to all the services that they needed, like food stamps and immunizations and enrolling their children in school and getting a Social Security card and finding them a job until they were able to be self-sufficient, and then they moved on to California to be with family. Now, last year they took in a refugee family. Now remember, a refugee is a person who flees a country in fear of their life. So this was a refugee family from the Congo. They had had refugee status for 17 years before they were able to get here to get a help and assistance. And they're doing the same thing for them that they did to this Burmese family. Now, maybe that wouldn't be a cup of tea for St. Paul's, but there's still a lot that we can do in regard to this issue. We can provide financial and legal support. We can assist other congregations as they care for migrants or refugees. Or we could take the big step and take in a refugee family or a migrant family. That would be up to you. Just throwing it out there. There was a church when we went to Triennial in Minneapolis 2 years ago. There was a church in Arizona, Phoenix. They did take in an undocumented woman. Her paperwork was a disaster, and she could not get her status changed, and they were going to deport her. So the church actually housed her in their facilities for a period of time to get things straight. One thing about it is we don't know much about being a citizen. We were born this way. You cannot even start this citizenship process for 5 years, and it's an expensive step to take. So no wonder we have lots of people that are in a limbo status that come here to our country. So that was an education for me. Now, in support of the Sanctuary Memorial, I didn't do, but 600 other voting members did. They marched to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement building in Milwaukee. It was in downtown Milwaukee. It was a mile march over there and a mile march back on a very hot day. One media compared this march to Martin Luther posting the 95 Thesis on the castle door in Wittenberg. This group taped 9.5 Thesis to the office building door of the ICE building. So kind of a good comparison there. There was an individual that was marching who had a sign that says, "We are putting protest back in the word Protestant," which I thought was pretty strong. The Assembly also passed a social statement Faith, Sexism, and Justice, also called Women in Justice. This project has been in research and preparation since 2012, and I felt this was an example of how far-sighted our ELCA is. I mean, this was way before the Me Too movement, and here's ELCA researching and preparing a social statement. This statement addresses gender-based violence and harassment, workplace discrimination for women, and salary and hiring inequality. It referred to, and we're all aware of this, we just don't say it very often, this is a patriarchal society. Men are essentially in power and in control. Now, that's not a bad thing, but when they use their power and control for an injustice purpose, it does become a problem. The ELCA posted that 31% of their ordained women have at one time or the other had difficulties being hired. If they are hired, they are hired at a lesser pay rate than their male counterparts, and they also frequently experience harassment in the workplace. Now, this is not a statement, a social statement just for ordained women in the ELCA. This is a social statement for all women, because at one time or other, all women have experienced one form of injustice. The next step was the Declaration for Interreligious Commitment, which was passed by a vote of 890. This declaration proclaims that we are a part of an ecumenical movement to engage with all religious bodies to promote the good news of the gospel. In this group picture, there are 39 different religious bodies being represented, including Muslims and Jews. As one of the individuals spoke, he says, we need to work shoulder to shoulder to promote greater cooperation and collaboration. Now, I don't have this on my script, but there were two other declarations that were also passed that I thought were very powerful. One was a declaration to the people of African descent, and another one was to the Jewish community. And both were declarations in the form of an apology. We as the ELCA apologized to the people of African descent for the years of slavery they experienced, for the racism that still continues today. And we also apologized to the Jewish community for the words of Martin Luther. If any of you have read some of his writings, he was very anti-Semitic against the Jewish community. In fact, what was really scary is Adolf Hitler used some of his writings as he developed the Holocaust idea. So there was an apology given. And one of the things that Bishop Eaton said in this apology was, when we are silent regarding any issue, we are as complicit as the perpetrators of the injustice. And I thought, how many times have I sat back and was quiet about an issue, didn't speak up, and allowed something to happen? And I know we've all been in that position. I thought Bishop Eaton really hit the nail on the head there. Now, finally, there was fun. On Friday morning, we had a celebration. And as you can see, it's a bunch of women, because this was the church service where all the ordained women were invited to come for celebrating 50 years since the first woman has been ordained in the Lutheran Church. And so they gathered for worship. And I would say, I never heard a number, I would say there was well over 200 women that marched down that aisle as ordained members. And as you can see, they had a whole lot of fun. This next year in 2020, we are going to celebrate 3 anniversaries in the Lutheran Church. One of those being 50 years since the first women were ordained in the Lutheran Church, 40 years since the first woman of color was ordained, and 10 years since we have been ordaining pastors who are in same-gender relationships. So next year, 2020, will be a big celebration year. On Friday evening, we had a banquet which we honored these ordained women. And 5 such women stepped up and spoke about their experiences of going through seminary and their experiences in their churches when they were called to serve their pastoral duties. a woman by the name of Pastor Elizabeth Plotz was there, and she was the first woman ever ordained in the Lutheran Church. And for her to become a pastor was a shock, because she said, I went to college, and there was this class I wanted to take. And for the life of me, I can't remember what that class was. But she said, I went to the dean several different times asking to take this class. And he kept saying, if you're not going to seminary, you can't take this class. But she wanted to take that class so bad, she says, fine, I'll go to seminary. And she became a pastor, and she made history. And she has connection to us. Pastor Stephen she was his campus minister at the University of Maryland, and was very instrumental in getting him to go into ministry. So he told me about her before I left, and he says, if you get a chance, give her my greetings. Well, this big banquet, there was no way to approach her, and I thought, well, that's not going to happen. But as it would be, I got to the hotel, and who came into the hotel was Elizabeth Plotz. So I just took all my gumption, and I went up to her and introduced myself and said, our pastor at Colcamp is Stephen Zeller. And she said, oh, yes, I remember Stephen. He was such a kind, thoughtful young man. And I says, yep, we all know that. So I want to thank you for listening to my stories. If you have any questions, I have it all right in here, and I'll be glad to share. If you ever have the chance to go, do so. It's highly inspirational. Thank you.